Hey friends, tonight we're stepping quietly into the candlelit halls of the medieval world, not to marvel at chivalry or feasts, but to uncover something colder, quieter, and far less romantic. This isn't the hospitality you've seen in storybooks. This is the kind that came with conditions, with rules no one said out loud, and consequences no one dared question. So before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the stories I share here. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, get cozy, and let's begin our journey into the dark side of medieval hospitality nobody talks about. The hidden chambers where guests were watched while they slept. Imagine yourself traveling through the English countryside in the 15th century. The sun has long set behind the hedgerows, and the distant hoot of an owl signals the deepening of night. You're a guest at a grand manor house, grateful for shelter, warmth, and a heavy supper. The host seems gracious. The chamber is well appointed. The fire is low but steady. The door closes with a soft wooden thud. And behind that thick stone wall, you believe you are finally alone. But you aren't. Across England, and in pockets of France, the Low Countries, and parts of the Rhineland, certain manor houses were constructed with a peculiar feature that remains absent from most architectural records but occasionally appears in the margins of personal chronicles, legal complaints, or servant testimony. Behind the guest chambers of these homes, narrow passageways were built, crawl spaces, sometimes little more than shoulder width, nestled between the outer wall and the paneling of the room. Their purpose was never formally recorded, but their presence has lingered in quiet footnotes for centuries. In the few rare accounts we have, owners of such homes justified the spaces as precautions. Security tunnels, one steward wrote, to observe unknown travelers for signs of treachery or danger. This was an age when hospitality carried real risk. Bandits could masquerade as pilgrims. Even lesser nobles sometimes traveled with ill intentions, their swords hidden under good manners. So hosts, ever wary, claimed they needed to know who slept beneath their roof. But not every use of these spaces aligned with those explanations. Through tiny, almost invisible slits, no wider than a quill, servants were instructed to watch. They observed quietly, reporting on everything from whispered conversations to odd habits to restless dreams. In some houses, a rotating schedule ensured that a guest was never unwatched after dark. And though no formal law prevented this intrusion, it lingered uncomfortably close to the boundaries of what was considered decent, even by medieval standards. One account from 1483, written in a careful hand by a monk named Edric who was traveling through Kent, describes a sleepless night in a guest room that echoed with a sigh not my own. The walls, he said, seemed to listen. He later learned from a serving girl, perhaps speaking more than she should, that her master liked to know what kind of dreams his guests carried. In another household in Flanders, a legal record details a minor scandal in which a noblewoman discovered that her nighttime prayers, murmured by candlelight in a guest chamber, had been paraphrased at the breakfast table by her host. She left the house in fury, but the matter never reached court. And so we're left to wonder, what did these quiet observers hope to find? In part, it was control. In the medieval world, knowledge was power, not just over land or coin, but over people. To know a person's fears, their regrets, or simply their secrets was to gain an invisible edge. Guests, especially those of importance, might let their masks slip in the dark. A whispered name, a midnight tear, or a document hastily read by firelight could shift alliances or trigger scandal. For the ambitious, the silent walls became a tool. But the practice was not always sinister. In a few documented cases, these spaces were used more benignly, perhaps to monitor an ill traveler, or a pregnant guest, or simply to guard against theft from the household. Some chroniclers suggest that listening to murmured dreams was once believed to reveal divine signs, and so some religious hosts may have considered it a kind of moral stewardship. The construction of these chambers varied. In grander homes, the passage was stone-lined and ventilated, cleverly concealed within the thickness of the outer wall. In more modest manors, wooden panels and simple crawl spaces served the same function. These designs rarely appear in architectural plans but can sometimes be inferred from unusual wall thicknesses or forgotten trapdoors uncovered during restoration. In one 20th century renovation of a Tudor estate, a builder discovered a dust-choked corridor no more than 2 feet wide running along the exterior of a guest bedroom. At shoulder height, narrow slots spaced evenly in the wall. They aligned, almost perfectly, with the canopy bed on the other side. The past, it seems, has a way of revealing itself in fragments. Of course, not every guest chamber concealed a secret watcher. Most travelers were indeed left in peace. But the idea that some were not, that a gentle smile from a host could mask silent surveillance, gives us a glimpse into a world where privacy was a luxury, not a given. And so, in the candlelit hush of a medieval night, as firelight flickered on the walls and footsteps faded into distant halls, a traveler might finally slip into slumber, never knowing that behind the paneling, breath held, someone else was awake, listening. This quiet intrusion speaks to more than architectural curiosity. It reflects the delicate tension of hospitality in the medieval world, a relationship built on mutual need, colored by hierarchy, suspicion, and power. Guests offered status and stories. Hosts offered shelter. But beneath the warmth of fire and feast, there lingered the subtle fear that every alliance was temporary and every secret valuable. You might drift off now, letting these walls fade in your imagination, the stone growing soft and distant. But somewhere, in some forgotten chamber behind a painted wall, dust still coats the floor of a space meant not to be walked, but to watch. And the question, gently folded into history, remains. If the room had ears, whose voice did it remember? The feasting hall where refusing food was a dangerous insult. Imagine yourself stepping into a grand feasting hall of a 13th century stone castle. The hearths are alight with a steady orange glow, casting shadows that flicker against tapestries embroidered with hunting scenes and ancestral coats of arms. The air is warm and layered, part roast meats, part damp wool, part beeswax. Outside, the wind howls across the moors, but here, inside, it is a world apart. A controlled ritual unfolds. And in this ritual, every gesture matters, especially what you do or don't eat. To dine in a noble hall during the late medieval period was not simply a matter of sustenance. It was a social performance governed by an unspoken script. Meals were an extension of politics, loyalty, and status. And within this ornate theater, food carried meaning far beyond its taste or ingredients. The rules of these halls were not posted on walls, but everyone present, whether knight, diplomat, merchant, or distant cousin, knew them. Chief among them was this: you do not, under any circumstance, decline what is offered to you. Refusing food was not taken as a matter of personal preference. To leave a dish untouched, or worse, to wave it away entirely, was a subtle but unmistakable insult to your host. It implied suspicion of their kitchen, their hygiene, their customs, or even their honor. And in a world where hospitality was one of the few threads holding elite society together, honor was everything. The host's reputation was often defined by the abundance and variety of his table. A nobleman who could offer imported spices, rare game, or extravagant trenchers of gilded pastries was not only demonstrating wealth, he was performing generosity, establishing power, and sending a message: you are safe here, and I am powerful enough to ensure it. To reject that offering, even politely, was to unravel the performance. Historical records from France, England, and various German courts hint at the subtle punishments dealt to those who transgressed these unwritten codes. Chroniclers tell of minor nobles who found their invitations quietly rescinded. Their names, once scribbled onto feast day rosters or hunting guest lists, vanished. No confrontation, no official insult, just an absence that deepened with every passing season. Other guests, especially those suspected of being spies or agents of rival houses, were watched more closely. Some never returned from their travels home. Of course, such disappearances were never officially linked to the feast. But it was understood. A man who insulted his host in the hall might not live to do so again. It's worth remembering that medieval hospitality was both a gift and a gamble. A host was responsible not only for feeding his guests but for protecting them. To invite someone under your roof was to stake your reputation on their safety and satisfaction. This is why noble hosts often used food as a test, presenting unusual or even questionable dishes to see how guests would respond. Those who accepted everything, even the strange or unfamiliar, were seen as respectful. Those who hesitated might be marked as untrustworthy or disloyal. The pressure wasn't always spoken aloud, but it was deeply felt. Imagine yourself handed a dish of pottage thick with unfamiliar herbs, or a roasted bird served whole, eyes still intact. You pause, perhaps out of confusion or mild unease. But in that pause, every servant in the room is watching. So are the other guests. And perhaps, at the high table, your host's gaze lingers just a moment longer than it should. To survive such moments, many travelers train themselves in the art of the polite bite. Even if one could not stomach an entire plate, a symbolic taste, just a morsel, could restore harmony. It was enough to suggest deference, that you were playing your part in the dance. The ritual extended beyond food itself. The sequence of dishes, the pace of service, and even the carving of meat all followed strict customs. Certain courses were served only to guests of a particular rank. The carving of a boar's head, for instance, was often reserved for the lord himself or his designated steward, and mishandling it, cutting too soon, or touching it without permission, could signal presumption. In elite circles, hosts sometimes arranged meals specifically to observe how a potential ally handled such moments. A nobleman hoping to forge a marriage alliance might invite a young suitor and serve dishes known to test the boundaries of etiquette. A slip, declining a dish, spitting out a spice, drinking too quickly, might doom a proposal before it even reached negotiation. Even religious fasting had to be navigated with care. Monks and pious guests might quietly abstain from certain meats, but even then, the expectation remained. Explain yourself gently, show gratitude, and never act as if the host's provision was beneath you. Of course, not all feasting halls were so perilous. In smaller manners and among more familiar guests, there was often room for laughter, indulgence, and even the occasional culinary disaster. But in the larger courts, especially those near seats of power, the feast was not just a meal, it was a stage. And every guest played a role. Over time, these customs evolved. By the late Renaissance, ideas about personal taste and dining decorum became more formalized. Guests began to use handkerchiefs to signal when they were finished or decline seconds. But in earlier centuries, the expectations were far more visceral, and the consequences more quietly brutal. Today, it may be difficult to imagine how a spoonful of stew or a slice of cheese could carry such weight. But in the world of medieval power and pride, those small gestures were everything. They were the difference between alliance and enmity, between a second invitation or a name quietly scratched from history. So the next time you picture a grand medieval feast, goblets raised, laughter echoing off high rafters, remember this: beneath the noise and color was a fragile equilibrium, and every bite was part of the performance. The fortress gatehouses that locked at dusk and never reopened, the sun has dipped below the edge of the forest. The sky is darkening, the last ribbons of light stretching across a horizon that glows like old parchment soaked in wine. In the shadow of the high stone walls, the drawbridge creaks one final time, and the great portcullis groans as it descends. Thick iron teeth touch the ground with finality. For the night, the castle is sealed. This was not an uncommon scene in much of medieval Europe. Whether nestled atop a rocky outcrop or embedded within the fortified heart of a town, many strongholds followed the same ritual. At dusk, the gates were locked, and they would not open again until dawn. Not for travelers, not for merchants, and certainly not for those who had simply misjudged the distance or the time. Imagine yourself as one of them, arriving just minutes too late. The torches atop the ramparts flicker to life, casting elongated shadows across the stone. A faint voice from above tells you nothing can be done. The rules are the rules. So you wait, in the cold, the dirt, perhaps beside your mule or cart, hoping the wolves you heard earlier keep their distance. You're being watched but not welcomed. Gatehouses were not simply doors. They were defensive machines, complex and intentional. Many were multi-level structures, with murder holes in the ceilings and arrow slits at every angle. The design allowed defenders to observe, challenge, and, if necessary, repel. But they also symbolized something quieter: order, routine, and a kind of authority that rarely bent, even for desperation. During the 13th and 14th centuries, many towns across England, France, and the Germanic states had gate curfews formally written into law. In some places, the bell would toll a specific number of times as dusk approached. In others, the locking of the gates was a communal event, a performance of security, watched by those within and feared by those without. The locking ritual might involve not just the portcullis but also heavy wooden doors, iron bolts, and sometimes even chained guards. It wasn't paranoia. Banditry was a real threat, particularly during times of famine or civil unrest. The idea of leaving a gate open after sunset was as reckless as sleeping with the front door wide open in troubled times. Even those granted royal permission to travel at night were sometimes denied entry if they arrived too late. Gatekeepers had orders, and very few were inclined to make exceptions. Records from Burgundy in the early 1400s describe merchants who camped outside walled towns for entire nights, their wagons huddled like beasts around a fire. They were not entirely alone. The gate towers often had narrow openings, no wider than a coin's edge, where guards would observe those waiting. Some towns employed watchers who took note of every arrival, not to assist them, just to know they were there. There's a kind of quiet in these accounts, a stillness broken only by the occasional footsteps along the battlements or the distant cough of a guard shifting in the cold. For those waiting below, time stretched. You couldn't knock. You couldn't beg. In many places, trying to force the issue could be seen as suspicious, cause for arrest come morning. Inside the walls, the rhythm of life was different. The gates locked not just danger out, but also a certain kind of unpredictability. With the world outside sealed away, townfolk could sleep. Inns and taverns served those who had arrived on time. Families ate, prayed, and drifted to bed knowing that the night belonged to them, and them alone. But there were exceptions, subtle, whispered ones. In certain towns, local children told stories of those who knocked 3 times and vanished. Or a candle lit in a certain upper window that meant the gatekeeper might, just might, bend the rules. It's hard to say how much of this was folklore and how much was the reality of small kindnesses carried out in secret. In castle towns, especially those near contested borders, the rules were strictest. During conflicts like the 100 Years' War, gatehouses became lines in the sand. Some castles even installed dual portcullises, one outer, one inner, designed to trap intruders between them. At dusk, the inner portcullis might be sealed first. Then the outer, drawn shut with chains, would slam down with a noise that echoed through the courtyard like a warning bell. In these places, being late meant being exposed. Travelers often took precautions. Way stations and pilgrim inns developed outside gatehouses, little more than lean-tos in some cases, but they offered a place to rest. It was understood in many communities that to be outside the gate at night was not necessarily a mark of foolishness, only misfortune. Still, the experience lingered. Diaries of journeymen and clerics occasionally mention nights spent in the shadow of a locked gate, their sleep uneasy, punctuated by dreams of doors that would not open no matter how hard they knocked. And yet, these same gatehouses were also places of welcome, by daylight. They measured both hospitality and suspicion. The same guard who watched you all night might greet you with warmth in the morning. The same iron gate that denied you might swing wide to let you in for trade, food, or festival. The structure had not changed, but the hour had. Even today, remnants of this ritual persist in the language of border control, curfews, and closed checkpoints. There is something deeply human about the act of locking a door at night, of drawing a line between the known and the unknown. The medieval gatehouse simply took that instinct and built it from stone. As you imagine yourself lying there, wrapped in a cloak on rough earth, watched but untouched, you may begin to understand the mindset of those who lived in a time when every town was a fortress and every nightfall a reckoning. The fire burns low. The torchlight above fades to a dim orange. Somewhere, a hinge creaks as another door inside is closed. And still, the gate remains shut. The great hall benches reserved for the least trusted guests. Imagine you are a guest in the great hall of a medieval castle. The fire glows softly in the hearth, its warmth felt most by those seated closest to it. A servant directs you to a bench along the outer wall, beneath a narrow, arched window where cold air leaks in, no matter how tightly the shutters have been drawn. The draft settles into your bones. The seat itself is worn but serviceable, and no one remarks on your placement. But later, you'll notice that the most favored guests, wealthy allies, prominent clergy, old friends, were offered chairs closer to the head table, nearer the firelight, and well away from any chill. In some medieval halls, where every detail of presentation carried meaning, even seating arrangements were quietly loaded with intent. Not all guests were honored equally, and sometimes the discomfort was by design. The Great Hall was the symbolic and functional heart of most noble households. It was where the lord held court, where petitions were heard, meals served, alliances reinforced. Though its grandeur varied depending on region and wealth, the layout typically followed a hierarchy. The high table at the end of the hall was reserved for the lord and his closest companions. From there, seating radiated outward in descending order of status and favor. To the casual visitor, it all seemed formal but benign. In truth, it was a system of quiet social calibration. Benches along the outer walls, particularly those beneath windows or near doorways, were often left for guests who were considered useful, but not fully trusted. These included minor merchants, petty nobles with a reputation for shifting loyalties, or local rivals whose presence was a formality rather than a pleasure. Lords could not always refuse hospitality outright. Doing so risked causing offense, which could spiral into feuds or political fallout. But they could control how that hospitality felt. Seating someone along a wall where the stone never truly lost its winter chill was a subtle message. It said, "You may eat at my table, but you are not among my inner circle." The benches were plain, often backless, and slightly lower than the others. The fire's warmth rarely reached that far. The cold was not unbearable, just persistent, like a whispered reminder of your outsider status. And for those who had traveled long to be there, the discomfort only grew over the hours. Chroniclers and household accounts occasionally hint at these unspoken seating customs. One account from a minor English household in the 14th century describes how cloth merchants from the south were placed beneath the windslats, where the air moved brisk and the fire did not reach. The entry seems innocuous, but other notes reveal that the negotiations which followed saw those merchants offering significantly better terms than expected. As if, after a night of enduring the draft and watching others toast by the hearth, they were more pliable, more eager to return to good favor. The psychology of discomfort was well understood, even if not written about in modern terms. Cold, hunger, fatigue. These were tools, not punishments. They softened resistance. In a society where reputation and hospitality were currency, no one wanted to complain. To speak of the cold might seem petty, might expose you as delicate. And so, many endured it silently, even as their resolve thinned. For castle staff, it was simply part of their duty. Servants learned early on who sat where and why. Instructions were not always spoken aloud, but passed through glances, small gestures, and invisible choreography learned through repetition. A certain bench might be cleaned just enough to be presentable, but not so well that the wood gleamed. A cup refilled slightly less often. A plate removed before the guest had entirely finished. Not insultingly so, just enough to suggest attentiveness reserved for others. Of course, not all such placements were acts of mistrust. Some walls were genuinely drafty, some halls too crowded. But in certain noble households, the pattern was too consistent to ignore. A guest seated against the cold stone once might dismiss it as chance. But after the second or third visit, they understood. And if they wanted to rise in favor, they would arrive bearing better gifts. More generous tributes. More useful information. This quiet manipulation of comfort extended to other aspects of castle life. Rooms given to visitors might be placed beneath servant quarters, where footsteps creaked through the night. Beds might be stuffed with straw not quite fresh. Wash basins filled with water that was lukewarm, never warm. Hospitality remained technically intact, but always with a reminder, you are welcome, but not yet trusted. In a world where alliances could shift with the weather, the Great Hall became more than a place of food and festivity. It was a theater of unspoken judgments. Every glance, every dish, every seat communicated something. For guests who hoped to gain favor or feared they were losing it, these signals were studied with quiet desperation. Some eventually earned their place closer to the fire. Through years of reliable service or shrewd negotiation, they were invited to dine nearer the Lord, to sit in cushioned chairs with arms, to share wine rather than watered ale. Others were never moved. Their place remained along the wall, a subtle exile wrapped in civility. And some never returned at all. Whether out of insult or intuition, they declined future invitations. But their absence did not change the bench. It remained, always ready for the next name to fall slightly out of favor. So the next time you imagine a medieval feast, laughter rising, candles flickering, music humming in the rafters, remember the cold seats. The ones near the window. The ones by the door. Not quite outside, but never truly within. There, amid warmth and song, sat the guests who were being watched. Not with malice, but with quiet calculation. Not punished, only reminded. That comfort was never given freely. It was earned, measured, and withheld, one drafty bench at a time. The guest wing where walls were inscribed with oaths of loyalty. Imagine yourself arriving at the guest wing of a noble manor deep in the countryside of 14th century France. The stone beneath your feet feels cool, worn smooth by generations of hesitant travelers. The corridor is quiet, lined with heavy oak doors and tall, narrow windows that admit only slivers of light. Somewhere beyond the walls, a hearth is being stoked. You smell faint wood smoke, beeswax, and old wool. You've been invited, formally, politely, to stay here, though you suspect the host's intentions run deeper than simple hospitality. The invitation came sealed with an elaborate wax crest, delivered not by messenger, but by one of the Lord's own sons. Now, with your boots dusted and your cloak removed, a servant wordlessly leads you to a chamber. As the door opens, you notice something strange, what appears at first to be uneven plasterwork on the wall across from the bed. But as your eyes adjust, you realize the wall is covered with names. Some are carved deeply, almost aggressively. Others are mere scratches, shallow and quickly etched. There are pledges of loyalty written in cramped Latin, angular Norman French, and even a few scattered lines in Middle English or Italian. A few are so faded with time they're nearly illegible. Some are dated. Some are not. This is not decoration. It is a record. A ledger in lime and plaster, where guests like you were expected, perhaps even required, to inscribe an oath of loyalty before retiring for the night. The stylus rests on a small ledge beneath a sconce. There's no lock on the door, but you sense that this room is not as private as it appears. Such traditions were not universal across medieval Europe, but they were not isolated either. Chroniclers make occasional reference to guest wings or receiving halls where oaths were signed directly onto the walls. These were not theatrical rituals meant for show. They were tools of memory, a way to preserve not only the names of guests, but their promises, their alliances, and their weaknesses. In certain parts of Gascony and the Low Countries, there are still remnants of these guest walls, plaster fragments excavated carefully, revealing layer upon layer of inscriptions scratched beneath lime wash. The practice seems to have risen in times of instability, border wars, local rebellions, feuding noble houses. In such times, loyalty was currency, and the visible display of past promises became a form of insurance. Or pressure. Imagine a merchant, tired from travel, offered warmth and wine, but only after carving a phrase promising to respect the trade monopoly of his host. Or a knight, quietly compelled to pledge neutrality between rival cousins. Few refused outright. Hospitality in the medieval world was sacred, but it was never truly free. A refusal might be seen as dishonor, or worse, as a sign of future betrayal. The plaster made it permanent or nearly so. Written documents could be hidden, altered, or claimed to be forged. A wall bore witness silently. It couldn't be tampered with without visible damage. The oaths remained there long after the speaker departed, and the host could summon others to view them as needed: lords, bailiffs, abbots. An oath unfulfilled would not vanish in memory. It would still stare out from the wall, a quiet accusation. The texture of the wall shifted with time. New layers were added, often unevenly, as fresh coats of whitewash were scraped away for the next name. In some manors, a single rectangular section was preserved, a kind of stone-bound guestbook. In others, entire rooms gradually became inscribed. One 15th-century Italian estate near Mantua reportedly had a dining alcove where every wall bore inscriptions, some shaped like shields, others framed in inked designs. Guests were not always told this would be required. A few accounts describe nobles who would wait until the guest had sat down to eat, or was half prepared for bed, before gesturing toward the wall and saying simply, "It is our custom." The implication was subtle but clear. Those who did not sign would not be forgotten, only remembered differently. There's no known formal punishment written into law for breaking a wall pledge, but stories circulated nonetheless. A Burgundian guest who promised to support a marriage alliance but later broke it was said to have returned to the manor years later, only to find his name circled in red chalk. He wasn't harmed, but he was served no wine, and his bed was not warmed. A soft punishment, but public, and difficult to explain. Servants, too, played a quiet role. They dusted the inscriptions. They remembered where each name was carved. A particularly observant household steward might subtly guide a new guest toward a section of wall that bore the names of enemies or broken promises. It wasn't always overt, but the message lingered: you are not the first to pass through here. Others have come before you. Some were remembered kindly, some were not. And so, the walls bore witness to centuries of social negotiation. They were part of the architecture not just physically, but politically. In a world where alliances shifted often, and written language was still a privilege of the educated few, these plastered promises became an informal archive, a map of where trust had been offered, strained, or betrayed. By the late 16th century, the practice had largely faded. Stone and paneling replaced plaster in most manor construction. Private records grew more common, and public oaths moved back into formal courts and notarized halls. But traces remain. In a manor outside Lincolnshire, beneath layers of Victorian renovation, conservators recently uncovered a small panel bearing etched names in a medieval script, almost lost, almost illegible, but unmistakably deliberate. And so, as you settle into that guest room in your mind, beneath timbered beams and a candle flickering low, you might imagine your own name etched quietly on the wall. A phrase offered in trust, or in caution, preserved not on paper, but in stone and silence. You may leave in the morning, but the wall will remember. The hearthside conversations that became secret accusations. Imagine yourself in the low flickering light of a great hall hearth. The stone walls breathe in the warmth, softening the air just enough to let conversations stretch past formality. A few logs crackle. Someone leans in. A story begins. Not a public declaration, but something halfway between honesty and performance, where words loosen under wine, and laughter covers what might be too close to truth. In many castles of late medieval Europe, especially during the 14th to 16th centuries, the hearth was not just a source of heat. It was the emotional core of evening life. Lords and ladies, stewards and guests alike often gathered around the fire, not only to stay warm, but to share news, swap stories, or weigh the quiet politics of the day. These gatherings were informal, relaxed. But in a world where information was power, even the smallest comment could be worth remembering. Unseen or ignored were the servants moving silently behind tapestries or through shadowed archways, refilling goblets and stoking the flames. Their presence was expected, their voices were not. But their ears were always open. Some simply listened because it passed the time. Others, however, learned the quiet art of listening with intent. In certain households, especially those with ambitious lords or tense family politics, these casual conversations were not left to fade into smoke. Servants or chamberlains sometimes kept mental notes, or even written ones. A comment about a forgotten debt. a muttered grievance about inheritance, a veiled insult disguised as jest, all recorded not formally, but subtly, sometimes in the form of advice given to a superior later. "My lord, I overheard something last night you may wish to know." In a few rare letters that survive from noble correspondence, one finds phrases like, "He spoke too freely by the hearth," or "She was unguarded in the glow of the fire." These lines hint at a quiet system of surveillance, unofficial, but no less potent. It wasn't espionage in the grand sense. Rather, it was a form of passive accumulation, a way of shaping influence not through power alone, but by patiently harvesting information. One steward in Burgundy in the early 1500s described the practice plainly in a household account. "Words once dropped like ash at the hearth are kept in a second fire until they may burn anew." Not every castle practiced this, of course. Many hearthside conversations passed with no consequence at all. But in homes where succession disputes loomed or rival branches of noble families shared space uneasily, the hearth became a subtle battleground. Consider the case of a minor lord in Northumberland in 1479. During a midsummer feast, he made a passing joke about his cousin's riding skills. The words were meant in jest, perhaps. But the cousin had long nursed private resentment. A servant overheard the exchange and reported it, not to the cousin, but to the lord's rival brother. Days later, accusations of public insult and dishonor were quietly leveled. Land titles shifted hands that season, not from war, but from words. It was not always so deliberate. In some households, the gossip simply flowed until someone heard something they felt compelled to repeat. The fire's warmth had a way of softening restraint. With the tension of daylight gone and no parchment in sight, lords and guests sometimes spoke more plainly than they would in the council chamber. They confessed desires, bragged of conquests, social or otherwise, and speculated about others' fortunes. And if a servant heard something that could be useful later, it might quietly shape how food was served, which doors were locked, or what rumors were whispered to the next visitor. In larger castles, particularly in France and the Holy Roman Empire, certain members of household staff, particularly senior stewards and valets, were known to keep personal notebooks. These were not always for practical inventory. In some cases, scholars believe they were records of overheard remarks, especially from travelers and guests. While most of these notebooks are lost to time, scattered references in court depositions and confiscated letters suggest that many reputations were quietly managed with their contents. Still, life around the hearth was not grim or fearful. For many, it was simply a place to relax. Stories were shared. Music played. Dogs curled near the embers. The rhythm of the castle slowed as day gave way to night. But in the corners of the hall, between the shadows and the warmth, quiet memory took shape. And that memory could be summoned weeks or years later. He said it himself, someone might claim. "I remember it clearly by the fire on a night when the wind was high." That simple phrase could tilt the weight of trust, disinherit a rival, or justify a sudden shift in fortune. No written oath required, just the suggestion of a remembered sentence. You can imagine how over time, the wise became more careful. Voices dropped. Smiles tightened. Some guests even began retiring early or choosing quieter corners away from the hearth. The fire, once a symbol of communal ease, had become too central, too open. Even now, in restored castles where modern visitors stroll past reconstructed hearths and iron grates, it's easy to forget the role these spaces played. Not just as physical warmth, but as emotional testing grounds. Echo chambers where words seemed harmless, but lingered, waiting for context to change. And so the fire glowed, the gossip curled upward with the smoke, and the great halls remained full of laughter, warmth, and risk. Sleep gently now, knowing that not every spark becomes a flame. But some conversations, however soft, still leave their imprint in the ash. The abbey inns that overcharged pilgrims who couldn't read. Imagine yourself arriving at the gates of a remote abbey just as dusk settles over the countryside. You've been walking for days, feet blistered, throat dry, and clothes heavy with road dust. The warm light of lanterns flickers through arched windows. The scent of bread and tallow candles floats out into the cool evening air. You're a pilgrim, and your destination is still miles away. But for now, this abbey inn promises shelter. A roof, a meal, a bed. You pass under the carved stone archway and step inside. A monk in a rough brown habit greets you. He gestures kindly toward a narrow bench by the fire, then begins speaking in Latin-tinged formalities. You nod. You understand little of what's said, but you smile gratefully. You're given food, warm water to rinse your hands, a place to sleep. In the morning, you offer a few coins in thanks. The monk accepts them without comment. You leave believing you've been treated honorably. But weeks later, as your journey nears its end, you meet another pilgrim. He stayed at the same abbey and paid only half as much. This was not a rare story. During the height of medieval pilgrimage routes, whether through England, France, or along the Camino de Santiago, monasteries and abbeys became vital stopovers for travelers. Many of these houses of worship offered food and lodging to pilgrims as part of their religious mission. But the line between charity and commerce was often thin. And for those who could not read, it was easy to cross that line without ever realizing it. Abbeys that accepted guests often displayed posted rates for rooms, meals, and offerings. These were usually carved into wooden boards or painted onto plaster walls, formally and publicly in Latin or Latinized French. To the literate few, the prices were clear. But for the vast majority of medieval travelers, these inscriptions might as well have been spells. In 13th century England, for example, only a small portion of the rural population could read, and even fewer could read Latin. Among pilgrims who came from all social classes but often included peasants, widows, and common tradesmen, literacy was uncommon. So they relied on trust, on the word of the innkeeper, or the monk, or the steward who managed the abbey's guest house. Unfortunately, not all abbey innkeepers were paragons of virtue. Some chroniclers and local court rolls record disputes where pilgrims complained, though often too late, that they had been charged more than their neighbors. Others found that an offered donation was treated as mandatory payment. In one case near a priory in Norfolk, a local reeve noted that the price of lodging did rise for those who carried no script. No written letter of protection. No list of fair prices. No ability to question what they could not read. These abbey inns, though religious in nature, had to sustain themselves financially. Lodging pilgrims was expensive, fires had to be kept, bread had to be baked, and stews had to stretch to feed dozens on feast days. So over time, some abbeys turned their hospitality into quiet income streams. And one method of maintaining plausible fairness was to display transparent pricing in a language most guests could not decipher. To the illiterate traveler, the carved words on the wall may have looked sacred, biblical quotes, perhaps, or prayers. In reality, they might have listed meal surcharges, candle fees, or conditions of stay that only a trained reader could interpret. This created a kind of two-tiered system. Literate pilgrims, usually from the merchant or minor noble classes, could see when something was off. They might protest an inflated charge or invoke the written price as evidence. Illiterate pilgrims had no such defense. They relied entirely on memory, hearsay, or the mercy of the host. Some abbeys were more honorable than others. Orders like the Benedictines, for instance, emphasized hospitality as a sacred duty. Guests were to be treated as Christ himself. Yet even within these orders, the financial burdens of constant visitors sometimes led to more pragmatic, if quietly exploitative, practices. And it wasn't always overt overcharging. Sometimes it was subtler, a second bowl of pottage offered with a smile and later charged as a premium, a bedroll placed near the fire, then counted as preferred lodging. The guest might never know that their few extra coins were not expected of everyone. In rare cases, reforming bishops and visiting dignitaries took notice. A visitation report from the Diocese of Rouen in the early 14th century noted that certain houses have made commerce of the weary, posting rates that few understand. The language was careful, but the implication was clear. Some abbeys had turned hospitality into opportunism. The silence around these practices was part of what allowed them to persist. Pilgrims, grateful for shelter and wary of appearing ungrateful, rarely complained. The idea of questioning a monk or abbey steward seemed irreverent. Besides, even if one did raise concerns, there were few legal paths to resolve such disputes, especially for those who would never pass through the region again. And so, the wall inscriptions remained. Quiet, still, decorative, almost painted in faded red ochre or carved into beams above the threshold. They looked like blessings, and often they were, but hidden in their lines were the terms and conditions of a transaction only one party could fully see. Not every abbey acted in this way, and certainly not every monk or guest master exploited their visitors. But the pattern, while difficult to trace precisely in numbers, emerges through the margins, through the stories told in taverns, through the discrepancies noted by scribes, through the small injustices that often escaped official history. It reminds us how power isn't always about strength or wealth. Sometimes it lies in knowing the words on the wall, in having the script, while others walk beneath it, heads bowed, thinking only of rest and warmth. So as you imagine those tired pilgrims curled on straw mattresses beneath the rafters of a sacred guest hall, remember, not all deception wears armor. Sometimes it wears robes, speaks Latin, and smiles as it takes your coin. And the wall behind it watches in silence, holding all the truth you never knew to question. The guest rooms that were never warm no matter the fire, the hearth glows faintly in the corner of the room, its embers still alive, but offering little comfort. The flame had burned for hours, logs stacked deliberately, tended by careful hands. And yet the chill never left. The walls seemed to breathe cold. The floor, even under rugs, bit at bare feet. And the guest, no matter how fine their robes or how heavy their blankets, would wake up feeling as though they had slept in frost. In many old castles and manor houses across medieval Europe, not all rooms were built the same. Grand halls could be blazing with heat from great central fireplaces, kitchens thick with warmth and the scent of bread. But upstairs, in the north-facing wings or the tower chambers, there were certain rooms that carried a reputation. No fire ever seemed to warm them. Some believed these were simply quirks of medieval architecture, poor insulation, thin mortar, windows that refused to seal. But over time, stories began to surface, passed in quiet tones by visiting envoys or recorded with curious detachment in the margins of travel journals and chronicles. These rooms, it was said, were not merely cold, they were kept cold. Intentionally. Imagine yourself as a visiting dignitary arriving after a long journey. You're welcomed with smiles, offered wine, seated at a generous table. You're assured that your guest chamber is ready and well prepared. And indeed, the fire is already lit when you arrive. A servant bows, closes the door behind you, and you are alone. But within an hour, your breath becomes visible. The walls seem to pull the warmth into themselves. You add another log and then another. Still, the cold deepens. Historical architecture offers clues. In some noble homes, ventilation shafts and wall cavities were built with great sophistication, not just for carrying smoke out, but sometimes for shifting heat between chambers. In a few rare cases, vents were disguised behind tapestries or wood paneling, opening into flues that led directly into colder sections of the stone wall. From a modern perspective, these may have been clever temperature regulators. But from a social one, they created very specific atmospheres. According to certain chroniclers, particularly in 15th century France and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, some guest rooms used these architectural tricks not for comfort, but for influence. A visiting official might spend the night shivering, his muscles aching from tension, his sleep fitful. By morning, he would find the fires in the great hall roaring, the hosts generous with warm cloaks, mulled drinks, or heated stones wrapped in cloth. And what had once been a proud, cautious negotiator might now be simply grateful. One scribe described a chamber in Burgundy where the stones seemed to weep cold even when 3 fires burned within. Another recounted an ambassador who became physically ill after 3 nights in such a room, convinced he had offended his hosts, only to be gently reassured and soothed with small concessions, after which he signed away trade privileges he had once fiercely guarded. Of course, these are not tales of torture or overt coercion. The chill was not unbearable, just persistent, enough to sap strength, blur thoughts, and make any gesture of warmth feel disproportionately generous. It was diplomacy not by force, but by discomfort. Rooms like these weren't common, but they weren't mythical either. Even today, some preserved castles contain chambers where no amount of modern heating seems to take hold, likely due to hidden ventilation designs long forgotten or shifts in the structure over centuries. Their legends have lingered too, stories of cold guest quarters nicknamed the Ambassador's Den, or the Iron Room, or simply the North Bed. For the medieval elite, every detail of hospitality was loaded with meaning. A warm welcome could signify trust and alliance. A lukewarm greeting, quite literally, could signal suspicion or a gentle warning. The positioning of a guest room, the materials in its walls, the orientation of its windows, even the distance from the main hearth all mattered. Cold, in this context, could be as loud as a slammed door. And yet, not all guests left resentful. Many wrote of their gratitude, their relief at being offered warm food after a long night, or the sense of intimacy created by shared hardship. There is a psychological effect in play here, known today as contrast bias. When you've suffered mild deprivation, even small comforts feel luxurious. A warm towel after a freezing bath, a kind word after a cold silence. This phenomenon, whether understood consciously or not, shaped more than just diplomacy. It shaped memory. Guests often remembered their hosts as gracious, even when they had been made to endure. The very discomfort became part of the story they told at home, a kind of silent badge of what they had endured to keep the peace, or to close the deal. In later centuries, as castles gave way to manor estates and then country houses, the tactic evolved. Guest rooms became less severe, but subtle hierarchies remained. Preferred guests were given sunlit suites. Others found themselves in damp corners or near drafty stairwells. It was no longer about vented cold, but about atmospheres, what the room made you feel, and what that feeling suggested about your status. As you lie in the imagined quiet of one of these rooms, wrapped in heavy wool, staring at a fire that refuses to spread its warmth, you begin to understand the message being delivered, not in words, but in air, in stone, in the long hours between dusk and dawn. Hospitality, in the medieval world, was never just about comfort. It was a coded performance, a layered dance between power and appearance. And the room that was never warm was speaking to you all night. The hall of tapestries that masked listening niches. Imagine yourself seated in a grand hall. The walls are lined with thick, embroidered tapestries, majestic scenes of hunts, saints, or mythic battles. Their fabric softens the acoustics, lending the space a hushed, reverent air. Firelight plays gently across the woven surfaces, animating the figures in subtle motion. It feels warm, enclosed, safe. You lean closer to your host, perhaps to share a confidence, a question, a concern you wouldn't utter aloud in the presence of others. But behind that wall of woven threads, someone may already be listening. In certain noble households, especially during the late medieval period, tapestries served more than decorative or insulative functions. They were part of a careful architecture of control. While their primary purpose was indeed to warm cold stone walls and display wealth or piety, their placement was often strategic, covering not just plaster and masonry, but narrow alcoves, hollowed wall chambers, or hidden corridors. These concealed niches were sometimes just large enough for a servant or trusted retainer to crouch within, still and silent. From behind the tapestry, they could hear everything that occurred just a few feet away, especially when guests believed themselves unseen. The rustle of robes, the murmur of speculation, the quiet unraveling of secrets. The fabric dulled echoes but carried voices clearly when the listener knew how to lean just right. In castles where politics, succession, and regional loyalty could shift overnight, the value of overheard words was not trivial. A careless whisper between guests, a passing mention of dissatisfaction, or an offhand boast could all feed into a lord's understanding of who was loyal and who was not. And unlike direct interrogation or spying in the open, these listening alcoves offered complete deniability. The guest never saw the watcher. The watcher never had to speak. Descriptions of such arrangements survive more in implication than in blueprints. Medieval architects rarely recorded the covert features of noble residences. But in a few surviving examples, notably in parts of France and Burgundy, small wall spaces adjacent to great halls have been discovered, spaces too narrow to serve as storage, too intentionally placed to be random. Often they are found behind tapestry hangings, near the guest seating areas, or flanking doorways where conversations naturally clustered. Chroniclers of the time made subtle reference to hearing walls or echo keepers, euphemisms that hinted at known realities without naming them. One account from the early 15th century describes a visitor to a northern English estate who, upon noticing how servants moved oddly behind the walls, remarked that the house itself had ears and clever ones. Another guest, writing years later, recalled with regret how a private jest shared beside a lion hunt tapestry reached the lord's ear by morning, costing him a lucrative trade agreement. Servants placed in these niches were not always regular household staff. Often, they were men or women handpicked for their discretion, patience, and loyalty. To sit motionless for an hour or more in the dark behind thick cloth, resisting the urge to shift or clear one's throat, was its own form of discipline. And the task was not glamorous. Many spent long hours listening to mundane gossip or petty complaints, hoping for a few words of value. But when those words came, they could change the direction of negotiations, marriages, or alliances. Guests, of course, gradually learned to suspect the tapestries. Some began to speak only in open courtyards. Others whispered while walking, moving too quickly for any one niche to hold their entire conversation. Still, few felt bold enough to accuse their host outright. To question the honesty of one's hospitality was dangerous, more dangerous, often, than silence. Over time, awareness of these practices led to a kind of performance. Savvier guests might deliberately say misleading things near tapestries, testing whether word would travel. Some lords even encouraged this. The game of deception became layered, recursive. Who was listening? Who knew they were being listened to? Who was pretending not to know? It's important to note that these alcoves weren't used constantly, nor in every hall. But their mere possibility added an invisible pressure to noble life. The walls might not always be listening, but you could never be certain when they were. From a broader perspective, this tactic reflects a truth about medieval life, that the appearance of privacy was often just that, an appearance. Within castles and manor houses, information was currency. Servants observed, walls absorbed, and speech was rarely free from consequence. Tapestries, with their intricate scenes and soft folds, were perfect camouflage. They gave the illusion of warmth and story. A knight rescuing a maiden, a king hunting a boar, a saint resisting temptation. While guests admired these tales, the real story unfolded silently behind the threads. Modern visitors to such halls rarely think of these hangings as anything more than art. But once you understand their hidden purpose, the space changes. What seemed beautiful becomes unsettling. The woven eyes of saints and monsters may not be the only ones watching. And every whisper beneath the cloth becomes part of a silent archive, curated not on parchment, but in memory. So imagine once more that you are seated in such a hall. You glance at the tapestry beside you, a golden stag chased through a forest of emerald leaves. The cloth moves slightly, as if stirred by a breeze. But there is no breeze, just a presence, waiting, listening, recording not just your words, but your tone, your doubt, your ambition. And long after the fire has gone cold and the feast has ended, the echo of your voice may linger, woven quietly into the very walls themselves. The banquet rituals that left no room to decline. Imagine yourself seated at a long, low table in a candlelit hall, the scent of roasted meats and fresh herbs hanging thick in the air. The flames in the hearth crackle softly, sending warm shadows across tapestries and wood-paneled walls. Around you, the sound of clinking pewter goblets and slow conversation fills the room in a rhythmic murmur, like the gentle tide. You are a guest, but not just any guest. You are being observed. In many noble households across medieval and early modern Europe, the banquet was not merely a meal. It was a performance, a ritual, and a negotiation all at once. Every dish placed before you, however strange, extravagant, or unsettling, came with an unspoken expectation. To partake was to accept the hospitality and, more importantly, to honor the host. To decline, even politely, could be seen as an insult far greater than it might appear. Chroniclers recorded these subtleties with quiet precision. In a 14th century account from Aquitaine, a visiting envoy reportedly refused a dish of spiced swan, citing illness. The host smiled, nodded, and offered broth instead. The next morning, the envoy's name was removed from a list of potential allies. No confrontation, no scandal, just a silent erasure. These banquets were elaborate, often involving dozens of courses, many of them symbolic. A pomegranate stuffed with almond paste might represent fertility and loyalty. A gilded fish presented in silence could carry overtones of faith, humility, or even submission. Each bite, each gesture, each glance across the table carried meaning. And meaning in such spaces was rarely optional. For the host, offering rare delicacies was more than generosity. It was a demonstration of power, wealth, and reach. Salted oranges from Sicily, candied rose petals from the Levant, and preserved sturgeon from the Baltic were all means of silently communicating influence. To turn such offerings away, however gently, might be interpreted not as dietary preference, but as a rejection of the host's status. In some courts, particularly in the Burgundy region during the 15th century, records mention that guests were expected to at least taste every course, no matter how small the portion. Even a token bite was preferable to none. To decline entirely was to upset the balance of deference and pride that underpinned the evening. A guest who refused food could be seen as doubting the quality, questioning the safety, or worse, refusing the symbolic alliance being offered. For those with religious restrictions, the situation became more delicate. A guest of Jewish or Muslim background might refuse a pork-based dish, even unknowingly. In some instances, hosts were understanding, especially in cosmopolitan trade cities like Venice or Cordoba. In others, refusal marked the guest as other, tolerated, perhaps, but no longer embraced. More often, though, the challenge was health or preference. Dishes featuring preserved meats, offal, or unfamiliar spices might be difficult to stomach. One 16th century English guest is said to have turned pale upon being presented with a whole peacock, feathers intact and gilded. He whispered that he was not feeling well, only to find that his seat was quietly moved to the end of the table the next day, near the drafty wall beside the servants. Hosts had long memories. There were quieter pressures too. The servant placing the dish would often linger just a moment longer than necessary. A steward might subtly nod toward the lord before setting the plate down. In some halls, the first course was served simultaneously to all, and no one moved until the guest of honor took the first bite. A pause too long, or a hesitant glance, and the tension in the room would thicken almost imperceptibly. And yet, for many, these rituals became second nature. Travelers wrote of developing a kind of performance, smiling softly, raising the spoon, tasting with reverence, regardless of the dish. One German merchant claimed to have swallowed a bite of raw eels soaked in vinegar, then immediately asked for the recipe. He was given a pouch of fine cloth as a token of goodwill before he departed. Sometimes the stakes were more formal. In certain Italian courts, elaborate feasts marked the finalization of contracts, marriages, trade agreements, political accords. Partaking in the meal signified not only participation, but assent. To decline a key dish was, in effect, to decline the agreement. Guests who demurred were occasionally asked to leave. One chronicler from Ferrara noted that after a minor noble refused a goose dish he considered unclean, he was escorted from the room and never again invited to court. Over time, some hosts introduced ways to soften the pressure. Tasting tokens were created, small bites shaped like the full dish, allowing guests to partake symbolically. Decorative plates were introduced, their contents meant only for display. But these accommodations were rare and often confined to particularly cosmopolitan or tolerant courts. And so, the tradition persisted. Banquets became spaces of unspoken rules, subtle coercion, and carefully staged performances. Each guest walked a fine line between honor and discomfort, between courtesy and compulsion. To be fed was to be bound, not only by hunger, but by obligation. Imagine, once again, that you are seated there. The table stretches before you, lined with flickering candles and dishes whose ingredients you cannot name. The host catches your eye and nods gently. A servant places something in front of you, a delicacy, perhaps, or a test. You pick up the spoon. You smile. You take the bite. Whether you enjoy it or not is beside the point. The courtyard where guests were locked out to prove trust. Imagine yourself approaching the high stone walls of a castle as the sun begins to disappear behind the treeline. The sky is streaked with the last copper light of evening. You've ridden hard to arrive before nightfall, but the road was slow, muddy, choked with brambles, and your horse limped the final mile. Now, at the edge of the outer courtyard, you find the gate shut tight. The porter watches from a narrow opening. You give your name, your reason for arrival. You mention the Lord's invitation, and then you hear the reply, "The gates are closed. You may wait until morning." It wasn't always personal, and it wasn't always expected. But for many castles, particularly those in the more defensive, uncertain regions of the British Isles, the Pyrenees, or the eastern edges of the Holy Roman Empire, locking out guests after dusk was not only accepted but ritualized. Even in the late Middle Ages, when hospitality was a social obligation, the drawbridge was still a line of power. Once it rose, no one came in, even friends. The custom was often explained as a test, not just of punctuality, but of character. Chroniclers noted that lords would sometimes schedule arrivals with full awareness that the hour would be tight. Guests who arrived just a few minutes too late might find themselves deliberately denied entrance, told to camp in the outer courtyard or shelter by the wall. They were watched but not welcomed. Fires might be lit for them, and food brought by a silent servant, but the gates remained closed. Some saw it as a show of strength. Others as an unspoken message: you are not equal here. No matter your rank, your bloodline, your gold, you were still subject to the rules of the gatekeeper. The courtyard, with its gravel paths and fading torchlight, became a place of enforced humility. In one 15th century account from a traveler in Bohemia, the guest writes of spending the night beneath the stars but in view of the tower windows. He had been invited to the castle, but delayed by a broken axle. Upon arrival, he was greeted not with outrage, but with polite refusal. "The gates are locked at the tolling of the bell," the porter told him, "even for friends." A page brought him bread and ale an hour later, but no apology. In some households, the practice became ceremonial. Certain lords, especially those known for their rigid adherence to custom, used the dusk hour gate as a social filter. Those who endured the courtyard with grace, waiting silently without protest, earned trust. Those who shouted, bargained, or demanded entrance were quietly noted. Hospitality, in this case, was not about comfort. It was about submission. You can picture the cold stone of the outer court, the sharp scent of horses nearby, the sound of distant laughter from inside, soft, muffled through the walls. The guest, once proud, now wrapped in a traveling cloak, sits on a wooden stool beside a fire that isn't his, on land he doesn't control, watched by men he cannot see. It was rarely cruel in intent, though it could feel that way. More often, it was strategic. In a time when betrayal often came from within, when letters bore false seals and handshakes could conceal daggers, this quiet ordeal tested not only the guests' patience, but their understanding of hierarchy. By locking the gate, the host reminded the visitor, "You are here by my terms, not yours." This practice wasn't universal. In wealthier courts of France and Italy, where diplomacy flowed more easily and danger was less immediate, gates were sometimes left open late into the evening. But even there, the idea of locked hospitality, welcome withheld until proven worthy, persisted in more symbolic ways. Seating orders at feasts, the timing of introductions, the length of time a guest waited in an antechamber before being seen. The architecture of trust was built slowly, and every threshold mattered. There are even tales, half fact, half story, of important deals forged in the outer courtyard itself. Two guests, both locked out, might strike an agreement around the fire as they waited. A lord might observe his visitor from a window, watching how they treated the servants or fellow travelers in that moment of vulnerability. In such cases, the courtyard became more than stone and space. It became a stage, a silent theater of character. Still, not every visitor took it well. Some stormed away into the forest. Others swore never to return. But for those who stayed, endured the chill, and passed the silent test, the gates opened with quiet ceremony at dawn. A fresh fire inside. A warm meal. A nod from the steward who now, suddenly, remembered their name. And though no one ever said it aloud, both host and guest understood what had occurred. The wall had drawn a line. And for one long night, that line had not been crossed. Now, centuries later, most of those castle gates no longer close with the same finality. Courtyards have become parking areas. Visitors come by bus, not horseback. But in the crumbling outlines of outer walls and the moss-covered thresholds where fire pits once flickered, the memory of that quiet ritual remains. You can almost still feel it, beneath the modern sky, in the silence of dusk, the weight of the gate, the flicker of uncertainty, the chill of being expected, but not yet allowed. And somewhere, behind old stone, a locked door still waits for dawn. The stone threshold that guests crossed at their peril. Imagine a narrow path winding toward a manor house nestled among rolling hills. You've been summoned, or perhaps merely invited, to dine with a local noble. The weather is calm, and the sun is low, casting long shadows across the moss-covered stones that mark the boundary between the manor and the outside world. As you approach the arched doorway, you notice a carved stone embedded in the ground just before the heavy oak door. It is polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. At first glance, it's just part of the entrance. But to those who knew the customs of the land, that threshold was more than stone. It was a silent contract. In parts of medieval Europe, particularly during the 12th to 15th centuries, entering someone's home, especially the home of a noble, was not a simple act of courtesy. It was a legal gesture. Chroniclers and legal scholars of the time sometimes referred to this as the binding threshold, a physical and symbolic line that, once crossed, carried with it expectations, duties, and, in some cases, consequences. Crossing that stone threshold, whether willingly or absent-mindedly, signaled something very specific. You had accepted the terms of your host's authority. Whatever unwritten rules governed that household, of behavior, of loyalty, of obligation, were now applied to you. You were no longer merely a visitor. You were bound, if only temporarily, to the social and legal framework of that hall. In a few regions, especially in areas of rural France, the Low Countries, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, the practice became codified. Local laws referenced entry rights or stone-bound agreements, implying that once a guest stepped over the carved lintel, they agreed, silently and legally, to abide by the customs of the house. Whether they understood this or not was considered irrelevant. Ignorance was no excuse. Some of these threshold stones were ornately carved. They might bear house sigils, Christian crosses, or more esoteric symbols like knotted ropes or twin beasts, which denoted hospitality, loyalty, and binding. These carvings weren't simply decorative. They served as physical manifestations of the agreement being entered. A guest may not have been able to read Latin or French, but they could see the knot. They could see the clasped hands or the entwined vines. The symbols said, "You are entering a place of protection, but also of rule." The consequences for crossing without care varied. In most cases, it was subtle. A guest might find themselves suddenly responsible for a favor they had not expected to owe. A visiting merchant, for example, might be asked to deliver a message or provide goods at a discount, with the implication that the meal they had just eaten was not freely given. Declining could be seen as dishonorable or disloyal. Chroniclers describe situations where failing to uphold such obligations led to feuds, lost trade privileges, or public shaming. In more serious cases, especially during periods of feudal conflict, crossing a threshold could place a person under the temporary protection, or jurisdiction, of the lord within. This meant that any prior allegiances could be momentarily overridden. A messenger from one faction, for instance, might find themselves legally bound not to spy or act against their host while under their roof. Crossing the threshold was a kind of oath, made with the body rather than the mouth. There were also recorded cases of legal sanctuary, where criminals sought refuge by crossing into sacred or noble spaces. In some areas, even a manor's threshold could serve as temporary asylum. Once across it, a fugitive might be granted a brief reprieve from arrest, as long as they followed the house's rules and made no attempt to flee. This made the threshold a kind of magical line. What lay on one side was lawless. What lay on the other, a complicated order. These traditions weren't consistent across all of Europe, and they varied greatly over time. But the idea persisted. The doorway wasn't neutral. It marked a passage between two states, outsider and insider, free and bound. The symbolism extended into ritual as well. In some regions, newlyweds were carried over the threshold to avoid stepping on it and inadvertently invoking some forgotten obligation. In others, those entering a noble house for the first time were expected to bow at the doorway or pause and touch the stone before stepping across. These gestures weren't merely respectful, they were protective. A moment of hesitation to acknowledge the space one was entering. Of course, most people in the medieval world did not have grand stone thresholds or carved symbols to worry about. The peasants' huts, tradesmen's homes, and roadside inns rarely carried such formal weight. But in the world of nobility, where law, status, and symbolism were tightly interwoven, every architectural detail held potential meaning. There's a quiet power in thresholds. Even today, we instinctively feel the transition when we move from public to private, from the street into a stranger's home. In the medieval world, that transition was more than emotional. It was legal, it was spiritual, and sometimes it was perilous. Imagine yourself, then, standing before such a doorway, your foot hovering above the stone. You've been invited, but you do not know why. You are hungry, tired, and cold. The hall beyond glows with firelight and the low hum of conversation. The air carries the scent of stewed meat and warm bread. But the stone beneath your feet waits, silent, carved, and watching. You step across. And from that moment on, you are no longer who you were outside. You are now, whether you know it or not, part of a system far older than yourself, one that remembers every footfall across its threshold and every silent promise made in stone. The chapel annex where overnight lodgers were expected to donate, the stone walls of the chapel hold onto the last of the afternoon sun. Light filters through stained glass in narrow beams, casting soft patterns onto the cold floor. A bell has just finished tolling. Vespers are over. Monks retreat to their cells, footsteps fading into cloisters. The main nave lies in stillness, but to the side, just past a low arch and behind a curtain of wool, there is movement. Here, in a small annex room adjoining the chapel proper, weary travelers lay out their cloaks. The floor is swept, though not freshly. A bench against the wall serves as a bed for one. Others settle against the stone, near the warmth of the inner wall. They are not monks. They are not pilgrims, officially, just passers-by in need of shelter. And the monastery, by long-standing tradition, does not refuse them. In medieval Europe, particularly from the 11th to the 14th centuries, monasteries were among the few places an unarmed traveler might reliably find shelter. Abbeys, priories, and friaries sat along pilgrimage routes, trade roads, and rural crossings. Some had full guest houses with appointed stewards. Others offered only what they could, often a simple side room in the chapel itself, where the smoke of incense still lingered in the stones, and the air never fully lost its chill. This space, sometimes called the chapel annex or poor men's room, was framed as a gesture of charity. A place to rest, pray, and be spared the dangers of the road after nightfall. But in practice, the arrangement came with quiet expectations. Imagine yourself arriving just before nightfall, your boots caked in earth, your breath visible in the dusk. A monk greets you with a nod, offers bread and thin soup, and gestures toward the chapel. There is no fee. Nothing is spoken. And yet, as you remove your belt and settle into a corner, you notice a small wooden box nailed near the altar screen, worn but locked. A single word carved into it, oblata, an offering. For centuries, such donation boxes were a common feature. Officially, giving was voluntary, a gesture of gratitude for the monastery's mercy. But over time, in many places, the gesture became expected. In certain abbeys, chroniclers noted how a guest who did not donate might find the next night's welcome less warm. Bread was thinner, blankets withheld. A stern brother might offer a few words about Christian duty. And in more organized monasteries, particularly Cistercian and Benedictine houses, the offerings were recorded in ledgers, kept behind the altar or in locked cabinets beneath the sacristy floor. These were not simply financial records. They were evaluations. Ledgers included names when known or descriptions when not. A tinker from Rouen gave 1 coin. A widow, no offering. A merchant servant, 2 denarii, candle stub. Over time, the entries formed a quiet archive of passing souls, many of whom would never return. Some abbeys developed unwritten scales. A nobleman was expected to give silver, a tradesman coin or goods, a peasant perhaps bread or a day's labor. These expectations rarely appeared in public rules but became embedded in practice. Some guests, aware of the custom, brought with them small gifts, a wedge of cheese, a needle, wax for candles, to offer as a sign of goodwill. And the offerings did serve a purpose. Monasteries were largely self-sufficient, but feeding strangers took its toll. Donations helped maintain the soup cauldron, repair sandals for journeying monks, or fund the next batch of ink and parchment. Still, for some houses, especially in lean times, the annex room became less a sanctuary and more a quiet source of income. There are recorded cases of abbeys who began to depend on these nightly visitors. One account from late 13th century Flanders tells of a chapel that extended its annex, adding cubicles separated by wooden partitions. The number of guests rose. So did the size of the donation box. But not all travelers came prepared. Some left nothing, either out of poverty or forgetfulness. And some monasteries responded with soft pressure, speeches during supper about the value of generosity, or quiet remarks during morning departure, delivered with calm precision, "May the Lord repay your visit in full measure, as you have measured out." Even more subtle were the physical cues. Blankets provided only after coins were seen. The best corners of the annex reserved for those known to give. In some cases, the charity room was made purposefully sparse to encourage guests to seek warmth in giving. But not all places adopted this silent economy. Some monasteries remained steadfast in open-handed charity, refusing to keep records, letting guests come and go without question. Others allowed lay brethren to manage guest relations entirely, separating the spiritual from the practical. Still, the pattern held in many parts of Europe for centuries. Hospitality was sacred, but that did not mean it was free from structure. You might imagine the experience as layered. A holy space, echoing with chant earlier in the day, now dim and silent. The stone cold under your blanket. A candle sputtering near the icon. And beside it, that box, sealed, waiting, a silent reminder. What would you leave behind? A coin? A prayer? A promise? The next morning, a monk might nod and hand you a crust of bread for the road. No mention of the box. No thanks given or withheld. But your name, or some version of it, may now exist in ink, behind a wooden panel, between the names of a peddler and a smith, on a ledger kept by candlelight. And as the sun rises behind the steeple, the annex grows quiet again, awaiting the next soul who knocks after sundown, hoping for mercy, and perhaps unaware of the cost it quietly carries. The high table where guests were sat to display their submission. Imagine yourself seated at the high table of a great medieval feast. The stone hall glows with torchlight. The scent of roasted meats drifts through the air, mingling with the sharp tang of wine and the softer sweetness of freshly baked bread. The entire room stretches out before you, dozens of lesser guests seated at lower tables, all eyes occasionally drifting toward the platform where you now sit, directly beside the lord of the manor. It feels like an honor, a seat of respect. But soon, you begin to notice the weight of each glance, the deliberate silence that follows your words, the subtle way your host listens not for your conversation, but for signs of obedience or defiance. Then you realize, this seat was not a reward. It was a test, or worse, a display. In many medieval feasts, seating arrangements were carefully orchestrated not just to reflect hierarchy but to enforce it. The high table, usually positioned on a raised dais at one end of the hall, symbolized authority. It was reserved for the lord, his family, and, on special occasions, his most valued allies and guests. But there were times when it was used for something far more strategic, to publicly position a rival, a petitioner, or a vassal in a place where their every gesture was on display. Chronicles from both English and continental courts tell of feasts where the most submissive or politically vulnerable guests were placed directly beside the lord. This was not an act of kindness. It was a performance, a way to demonstrate their diminished power not just to them, but to everyone watching. At first glance, such a guest might appear fortunate, close to the best food, the warmest fire, the most esteemed company. But proximity came at a cost. Every motion, every pause, was observed. If they ate too quickly, they risked seeming base. If they refused a dish, it could be taken as insult. Even the way they held their cup might be interpreted as arrogance or hesitation. In that space, politeness was not enough. Precision was required. A 14th century record from a Welsh marcher lord describes a visiting knight seated beside the host during a winter feast. The entry notes, "He did not speak unless spoken to, nor lift his eyes when the wine was poured." It was understood he was there not to enjoy the meal, but to be seen submitting. To occupy that seat silently was a performance of loyalty, one made more potent by its public visibility. This tactic was often reserved for figures who had recently rebelled or whose allegiance was uncertain. By placing them in the position of greatest visibility, the lord could symbolically reclaim authority. The guest, by showing deference in every motion, demonstrated to others that they had been humbled. The hall itself amplified this. The dais was a stage. Light from torches and candles burned brightest at the head of the room. Musicians and servers oriented themselves toward the high table. Even the acoustics, stone walls and high ceilings, carried the voices from the platform outward into the chamber below. A murmured remark at the high table might travel farther than intended. A visible frown could spark rumors before dessert was served. Some guests were acutely aware of this. Others realized it only too late. Chroniclers mention figures who left such feasts not emboldened, but diminished, aware that their presence had been used to confirm a social order they had hoped to rise above. It was, in its own way, a kind of symbolic capture. This use of seating as subtle coercion reflected a broader medieval practice, the weaponization of ceremony. Public rituals, be they feasts, weddings, or funerals, often served multiple purposes. They honored tradition, but they also shaped perception. Who stood where, who spoke first, who offered which gifts, all of it built a silent language of status and control. The high table was the most visible line in that language. And sitting at it could mean very different things depending on context. Occasionally, the tactic went further. A guest might be served last, even while seated beside the host, or given wine more watered than the rest. One chronicler tells of a minor noble seated at the high table who was offered cuts of meat already picked over, an insult dressed in silk. He smiled through it, raising his cup in gratitude. Because the message wasn't meant for him alone, it was for those watching. Of course, not every seat beside a lord was given with intent to humiliate. Many were sincere gestures of favor. But in moments of political tension, or during public reconciliation after conflict, the seat could become a quiet instrument of domination. The feast became a court, and the guest a witness or a defendant. In these moments, silence was survival. Subtlety was survival. And the high table, though set with silver and gold, could feel colder than any bench along the wall. So when you picture those grand medieval gatherings, the flickering light and the laughter echoing under timbered beams, remember this: not all honors were given freely. Not every place at the Lord's side was warm. Sometimes the highest seat was the hardest to bear. A place where power smiled down while pressing quietly on the shoulders of those who dared to rise too soon. And in those long meals, drawn out across hours of performance and scrutiny, submission was not just expected. It was displayed, one restrained gesture at a time. The hearth rug that marked the boundary of hospitality. Imagine a grand hall just after sunset, timber-framed, echoing faintly with footsteps and low conversation. The air carries the faint scent of wood smoke and damp wool. The hearth has been lit, and the fire casts a golden glow across flagstones that have known centuries of arrivals and departures. Near the center of the room, there lies a rug. Thick, faded, but carefully placed, always in the same position. It may not look like much at first, just a woven boundary between the ordinary cold of the floor and the warmth of the fire. But in certain manor houses from the late Middle Ages into the early modern period, this rug was more than comfort. It was a line, soft beneath the feet, but sharp in its meaning. To stand near the hearth was acceptable, but to step onto the rug without an invitation was an act of boldness, of presumption, even of disrespect. The chroniclers do not shout about this custom. They mention it in passing, with the kind of quiet acknowledgement that suggests everyone already understood. In one 15th century account from Northumberland, a visiting minor noble is described as having overstepped the fire cloth before the words were spoken. No punishment was recorded, only that he was housed separately from then on, and never invited again. Hospitality in medieval and early modern Europe was more than offering shelter or food. It was a tightly regulated dance of status, recognition, and unspoken rules. The hearth, especially in colder regions, symbolized more than physical warmth. It was the symbolic center of the home, where family gathered, where decisions were whispered, where loyalty was measured not only in words but in silence. The rug before it, then, became a silent but visible marker of boundary. To stand just outside it was to accept your status as a guest. To be welcomed onto it was to cross a threshold, not only into warmth, but into trust. And trust, as always, came slowly and with conditions. For those unfamiliar with the custom, it could be a trap of manners. A traveler weary from weeks on the road might instinctively step forward toward the fire, hoping to warm stiff hands or feet. But if the host had not extended that unspoken invitation, the rug's crossing could be seen as a trespass, an intrusion into symbolic space that was not yet offered. Some households formalized the ritual. A steward might gesture, or a phrase might be spoken, "Come closer to the flame, if it please you." In others, it was subtler still. The host might rise and stand behind the rug, waiting for the guest to follow. If the guest remained just outside, observing the unspoken boundary, it was a mark of grace. If they crossed too soon, servants would quietly stiffen. The moment might pass, but it would not be forgotten. The rug itself varied. In wealthier houses, it might be a Persian weave brought through Venetian traders, dyed in rich colors and marked with geometric patterns. In simpler halls, it might be coarse wool or woven rushes, plain but still carefully placed. Regardless of its quality, its meaning remained consistent. Warmth was not synonymous with welcome. There are stories, rare, but recorded, of deliberate humiliations. A rival guest invited to a feast, only to find themselves offered food, yet never the hearth. A knight allowed to speak in council, but always kept beyond the rug. In one case, a chronicler notes a guest stepping forward during winter, boots soaked through, only to be reminded by the steward, "You've not been called to the cloth." That guest stood back. The stain on his pride lingered far longer than the cold. Of course, not every household enforced the boundary. In some regions, especially in more egalitarian religious communities, warmth and space were freely shared. But even there, the positioning of rugs, benches, and hearth seats carried meaning. The fire was always more than heat. It was ceremony, inclusion, a test, quiet and unnoticed until you failed it. For children raised in such households, the lesson came early. A girl learning when to fetch wood, when to sit on the edge of the rug but not over it. A boy told to wait until the elder guest had crossed before approaching the warmth himself. These weren't rules written in ink or carved in stone. They were learned through observation, absorbed into the rhythm of daily life like a melody you didn't realize you knew until you hummed it. Imagine yourself now in such a hall. The fire crackles softly. Shadows dance against the walls. A servant has brought you food and nodded toward a bench. You are cold. The rug is only a few steps away, but no one has beckoned. No gesture, no phrase. You stay where you are. The host glances at you across the flame and nods once, approving, perhaps, of your patience. In a world without thermostats or central heating, the fire meant survival. But its meaning extended beyond temperature. It was a form of language, spoken through placement and gesture. The hearthrug said, "This far and no farther, unless you are asked." And so, many guests waited. Some were never invited across. Others were. But all remembered that warmth does not always equal welcome. Sometimes, the softest threshold is also the hardest to cross. The courtyard well where travelers were questioned at dawn. Imagine a quiet courtyard, still wrapped in the pale hush of early morning. The light has not yet warmed the stone, and the dew clings softly to every flag and timber beam. There is no fire yet in the great hall, no servants bustling with trays or buckets. But outside, beside the central well, a small group begins to gather. Travelers wrapped in cloaks, boots damp from the grass, eyes still heavy from a restless night. They wait not for water, but for a question. In many castles and fortified manor houses, especially across Central Europe and Northern England during the later Middle Ages, a peculiar ritual marked the start of each day for visiting guests. Before breakfast, before entry to the inner rooms, visitors were summoned to the courtyard well. There, in the presence of a steward or senior servant, they were asked, again, to declare their name, their purpose, and their intended length of stay. It was not a formality. It was a filter. The practice served multiple purposes. On its surface, it was a simple matter of security. In times of war, or even mild unrest, lords could not afford to trust memory alone. A guest might give one explanation at the gate by torchlight, and another by the morning sun. The well, a natural point of gathering, became the anchor for this second declaration, public, audible, and harder to obscure. Chronicles from the period record how this morning questioning often revealed inconsistencies. One guest might say he was a pilgrim, while a companion would later refer to him as a merchant. Another might claim to be traveling alone, only for a groom to mention tending 3 horses. In one 15th century letter from a Saxon steward, a note reads, "By the well, the red-haired man spoke as if for trade, but last night said he sought holy alms. I marked him for watching." The ritual also carried subtle power. It placed guests, no matter their rank, into a position of humility. To be questioned at dawn, still stiff from travel, surrounded by others doing the same, erased some of the distance between noble and commoner. Everyone, for that brief moment, stood as petitioners. And there was symbolism in the location. The well had long been central to daily life, source of water, news, and community. To stand beside it, facing questions, was to be made part of the estate's rhythm. Some historians suggest this practice may have echoed older customs, where oaths and judgments were delivered near communal wells or trees. By the late medieval period, the custom had shifted from ceremony to practicality, but the echoes remained. Not every household observed the ritual. It was most common in castles along trade routes or in contested regions, places where guests were frequent and motives less clear. In such households, the steward or gatekeeper often kept a small ledger, noting the names and stated reasons of each traveler. Cross-checking these details over time allowed the household to track patterns, alliances, or lies. But it wasn't always coldly administrative. In many cases, the well ritual became part of the expected rhythm of hospitality. Some lords used it to introduce guests to one another. A merchant from York might meet a pilgrim from Brittany in that quiet circle, their conversations continuing later over bread or wine. In this way, the questioning softened into routine, less interrogation, more morning acknowledgement. Still, not all guests appreciated the scrutiny. There are scattered accounts of offended nobles, particularly from southern regions, who found the practice distasteful. One Italian knight traveling through Burgundy wrote, "To be roused before the meal and spoken to as if I were unknown, this is no way to greet a bannered man." But even he complied. The gates did not open without the morning exchange. And it wasn't just the lords who listened. Servants too stood nearby, observing quietly. They noted who hesitated, who answered too quickly, who deferred to others when speaking. In some households, especially where tensions ran high, these observations were passed discreetly to the master of the house. Trust, in these environments, was not given, It was measured. Imagine the moment yourself. You stand near the well, the stone cool beneath your fingers. A breeze moves gently through the courtyard, stirring the fabric of your cloak. A steward approaches with a short list in hand. He asks your name. You give it slowly. He waits. You explain your purpose, trade, perhaps, or news from a nearby town. He nods, says nothing, then steps back. No judgment, no welcome, just the recording of a line in a book. And yet, something has shifted. You are no longer just a stranger at the gate. You have been seen, heard, and made part of the castle's careful morning ritual. You have stood beside the well as countless others have before you, and answered for your presence. The walls may not trust you fully, but they have begun to remember you. As the sun rises higher and the courtyard warms, the ritual fades into the ordinary bustle of the day. Fires are lit. Doors open. The smell of bread baking reaches the air. But the memory of the well remains, quiet, circular, and always listening. The upper gallery where watchers noted every expression. Imagine yourself seated in a grand feasting hall. Below the high-timbered ceiling, long tables stretch across the stone floor, draped in heavy linens, lined with trenchers and goblets. Candles flicker gently in wrought iron sconces, their glow casting golden halos onto platters of roasted meat and stewed fruits. At the center, the noble host presides at the high table, flanked by allies, family, and honored guests. Laughter rings out, low voices murmur behind goblets, and the music of a harp begins to drift from somewhere near the hearth. But above this scene, high above the floor and just beneath the rafters, there is another space. A narrow wooden balcony tucked discreetly into the wall's shadow. From down below, it might look like part of the architecture, simply a walkway for servants or a place to hang tapestries. But in truth, it had another, more silent purpose. It was the gallery of watchers. In certain noble halls of late medieval Europe, particularly those in England, Burgundy, and parts of Germany, feasting rooms were built with hidden or semi-hidden upper galleries. These were narrow wooden ledges, sometimes lined with screens or thin latticed panels, that allowed discreet observation of the events unfolding below. At a glance, they appeared ornamental, but to those within noble households, they served a more deliberate role. They were places where retainers, stewards, scribes, and even family confidants stood, not to enjoy the feast, but to observe it. Every nod, every hesitation before lifting a goblet, every subtle frown or glance of hesitation was silently recorded. In such spaces, diplomacy did not occur only in conversation. It unfolded in expression. Chroniclers from the period make occasional reference to these watchers. One 14th century account from the court of a minor English baron notes that the steward stood above in the lofted gallery, noting who ate heartily, who shared their meat, and who did not meet the Lord's eyes. It was not gossip, it was strategy. In the tense web of alliances, rivalries, and family entanglements that shaped noble life, even a poorly timed smile could become leverage. The gallery allowed hosts to gather information without the need for confrontation. Instead of placing a direct question, they simply watched. If a nobleman flinched when a rival's name was mentioned, or if he failed to rise when the Lord entered, it was all noticed. Such moments, fleeting and easily dismissed, were preserved in the minds of those above. It's important to understand that these observations were rarely about vanity. The medieval hall was a stage. Every gesture performed within it could affect landholdings, inheritances, marriages, or military alliances. When deals were struck between families, it was not only the spoken word that mattered, it was the confidence behind it, the hesitation beside it, the expression that flickered before agreement. And so, retainers stationed in the gallery reported not only what was said, but how it was received. A glance exchanged between two bannermen might suggest a private understanding. A noblewoman's fixed gaze on a rival's ring might signal envy or interest. These clues helped shape the decisions of the Lord. Who to trust, who to marry into, who to exclude from the next feast entirely. For the watchers themselves, the role was both privileged and perilous. They were entrusted with the Lord's reputation, but also with secrets that could turn dangerous. A scribe who misread an expression could spark an insult where none was intended. A steward who withheld a detail might be seen as complicit in deception. Therefore, they learned to be cautious, meticulous, and emotionally distant. In some households, the watchers were chosen not for their rank, but for their temperament. A quiet demeanor, a sharp memory, and the ability to stay unnoticed were considered virtues. And because these observations were rarely written down, their accuracy relied on the stability of oral memory. Patterns were more important than single moments. Repeated glances, unreturned greetings, the building blocks of trust or suspicion. From time to time, visitors noticed the gallery. A guest might look up and catch a flicker of movement behind the lattice, but they would say nothing. To acknowledge the watchers was to admit one was being watched, and that made everyone uneasy. There is a particular stillness in these stories, a quiet recognition that power does not always announce itself, that it listens, that it waits. The gallery was not a place of loud command. It was a perch from which the household protected its knowledge, its eyes always above, while its face remained pleasant below. This tradition, though rarely formalized, echoes even into later architectural trends. Elizabethan manor houses sometimes retained a version of these galleries, though they became more decorative. And in courts across Europe, the practice of silent observation persisted, not always in wood, but in protocol. Servants stood just out of view. Letters were intercepted. Dances were attended not to enjoy the music, but to read the silences between songs. So when you imagine that hall again, with its flickering candles and scent of rosemary from the fire, remember what lay just above. The gallery, the watchers, the eyes that did not blink when the goblet trembled, that noted who reached for whose hand beneath the table. And when the feast ended and the torches were extinguished, those quiet memories became the whispers behind the next alliance, or the wedge that cracked one apart. Because in the medieval world, to be seen was not the same as being known. And often, it was the watchers in the shadows, silent above the rafters, who knew the most. The chamber where guests were weighed with their belongings, the room was unremarkable, stone walls, low beams, a draught near the shuttered window. And yet, for those who passed through it, this chamber served as the beginning and end of their stay. At the center stood a large wooden platform, suspended by iron chains and resting upon a mechanism of counterweights and markings. It creaked faintly with the change of every season. And when a guest arrived at the gate before a bed was offered or bread served, they would be asked, calmly but firmly, to step upon it. In certain castles and fortified estates, particularly those along trade roads or in contested territories, there was once a curious custom. Guests were weighed upon arrival, along with all their possessions. The process was framed not as suspicion, but as order, a practical precaution. The castle, after all, offered protection. It was only fair to know exactly what entered, and what, in time, departed. The weighing chamber, often situated near the outer gatehouse or along a corridor leading from the courtyard, was designed with deliberate neutrality. Not austere, not welcoming, merely watchful. Guests might arrive with saddlebags, crates, fabrics, or coin purses hidden beneath tunics. These were loaded onto the platform along with the guest, one at a time, in full view of the steward or scribe. A mark was recorded, sometimes on wax tablets, sometimes in long ledgers with neat Latin annotations. No questions asked. Not yet. Imagine yourself as such a traveler, tired from the road, half covered in the dust of dry fields, your horse led away to the stables by a silent hand. You are brought into the chamber, asked to remove your heavier cloak, your satchel, your boots perhaps. They are placed beside you. You step onto the scale. The steward adjusts a small counterweight on an iron arm. He does not speak. Then he writes. This ritual served multiple purposes, all of them quietly efficient. First, it established accountability. If the guest were to depart lighter than they arrived, without explanation, it could be assumed something had changed hands. Perhaps something remained behind, deliberately or not. Or perhaps something had disappeared. In regions with fragile alliances or histories of petty theft, the weighing process acted as a silent deterrent. A guest might think twice before pocketing a silver spoon or an embroidered cloth when they knew their weight had been noted down to the stone and measure. Monasteries and royal households adopted similar practices, particularly when hosting high-value visitors. Some historians speculate that this weighing system also had subtler motivations. By knowing the total mass of a guest's belongings, stewards could assess wealth without asking impolite questions. A merchant who claimed hardship but arrived with 200 pounds of goods raised quiet eyebrows. A noble who departed heavier than he arrived might provoke curiosity. Was it a gift from the Lord? A trade? Or a miscount? There are records, particularly from the castles of Central Europe and the Italian city-states, of these weighings being conducted both at arrival and departure. The two figures were compared, sometimes with ceremonial formality. In one Venetian ledger from the late 14th century, a guest's entry reads, Signore of Mantua arrived with 126 libra, departed with 134. Adjusted under witness. Whether the discrepancy was ever challenged is unclear. Not every castle used this method. It was more common in strongholds where power was transactional, where protection, hospitality, and surveillance were intertwined. In such places, trust was a measured commodity. The weighing chamber allowed lords to extend courtesy while quietly safeguarding their own interests. And yet, this process was rarely harsh. Guests were not interrogated. The ritual was often framed with soft language, for the records, to ensure nothing is lost. A steward might smile as he explained the practice, even as he inked your total into the margin of a page already filled with other weights and names. The room itself was often unchanging. The same platform, the same beams overhead, the same worn markings etched into the wooden frame. If you returned months later, you might recognize it. And the steward might recognize you. He might flip back in the ledger, comparing notes, nodding once. You are familiar now. Trusted, perhaps? There's a strange intimacy in such cold record-keeping. Some guests, it said, would offer an extra item to be weighed separately, a token, they'd say, a gift for the host. Others grew uneasy. They packed differently. They whispered about items vanishing during their stay, nothing valuable but curious. A comb, a pair of gloves, a letter. In some castles, the weighing chamber doubled as a kind of archive. Old ledgers were kept in cabinets or behind a curtain, bound in leather, their spines labeled with years or the names of visiting houses. They were not public, but they were preserved. In a world without cameras, the weight of your presence was the closest thing to a record of your passage. The ritual faded over time, as centralized courts and more formal customs emerged. By the 16th century, the practice of weighing guests became rare, viewed as old-fashioned or even rude. But in certain corners of the historical record, it persists. A quiet room, a wooden platform, a pen scratching in the margins. And so, as you imagine yourself standing there, shifting slightly on the creaking boards, watching your belongings tallied and noted, you begin to understand something subtle. This was not just about theft. It was about memory. The castle recorded who you were in stone and measure. And whether you stayed a single night or a fortnight, the chamber kept the shape of you. Your weight. Your presence. The exact burden you carried into the dark. The sleeping niche where fires were lit just to impress. Imagine yourself arriving at a medieval manor after days on the road. The sun has just slipped behind the treeline, and the air carries the damp chill of an early spring evening. You're shown into a small chamber, modest in size but warm with the flickering light of a roaring hearth. A servant bows and tells you the fire has been kept ready since morning. The bed is turned down. The scent of smoke mingles with the faint trace of herbs hung near the shuttered window. For a moment you feel honored, cared for. But hours later, long after you've fallen asleep, the fire quietly dies. No one comes to add more wood. The warmth you believed was meant to comfort you was never meant to last. It was not hospitality, not truly. It was a performance. In many medieval manors and castles, especially those that sought to maintain appearances beyond their means or impress guests of uncertain status, hospitality took on an almost theatrical quality. And few gestures were more symbolic or more misleading than the hearth fire. To maintain a good fire required resources, wood, labor, and time. In wealthier halls, where wood was abundant and servants numerous, it was a daily luxury. But in more modest homes, or in households wary of showing too much favor, fires could be timed with precision. Lit shortly before a guest arrived, stoked high to create a glow of welcome, and then left to burn out in silence once the appearance had been made. These sleeping niches, small private or semi-private chambers built into manor walls or off great halls, were often reserved for guests of middling rank. Not quite noble, not quite servant. Their rooms might contain a bedstead, a wash basin, perhaps a chest for travel goods. But it was the hearth, when present, that gave the illusion of luxury. And illusion was the key. Chronicles and letters from the late Middle Ages occasionally remark on these gesture fires. One minor Italian traveler, lodging with a lesser-known baron in Normandy, wrote in his diary, "The hearth in my room gave off more warmth than any I've known, but only for the hour before sleep. By dawn, my fingers were stiff with cold, and I understood that the flame was not for me, but for my arrival." Another English account describes a manor that burned through a week's wood in a night, that a visiting knight might report home that he had slept in great warmth. The implication is clear. The warmth was a temporary illusion, a carefully placed act in a longer play of reputation and appearances. For the household, this brief blaze was a calculated offering. Warmth, like meat or wine, was currency, a gift to be used sparingly and when it would be most noticed. Lighting a fire before a guest entered gave the impression of constant comfort. Letting it fade once they were asleep preserved resources and avoided granting more than necessary. There was also a subtle power in it. A guest who awoke to a cold room was unlikely to complain. To do so would seem petty or ungrateful. Instead, they would remember the warmth at their arrival and assume the cold was their own failing, poor sleep, or thin blankets, or a draft that slipped in overnight. The host, meanwhile, retained the image of generosity, untouched by the quiet discomfort that followed. And discomfort, in this context, was not always accidental. Some lords used these gestures to place guests in their proper place. Not unwelcome, but not truly welcome either. Received with dignity, but without lasting favor. Just as certain benches in feasting halls were placed in the draught, or certain cups filled less generously, the management of fire was another quiet language of power. This practice was not limited to grand castles. In abbeys, where monks were bound to vows of austerity, guest chambers were sometimes briefly warmed to greet important visitors, particularly wealthy donors or potential allies in local disputes. But as soon as prayers ended and silence descended, the embers were left to cool. One Benedictine record notes the use of first fire logs, cut thinner than standard wood, designed to burn quickly and brightly, but not long. Guests occasionally caught on. A few, traveling with their own retainers, began bringing small bundles of firewood or coal, discreetly passed to their hosts in exchange for continued warmth. Others adjusted by sleeping fully clothed, or by rising early to pace the courtyard and chase the morning sun. But most accepted it as a quirk of travel, a discomfort endured in exchange for connection, safety, and the fragile networks of trust that bound medieval life together. To modern sensibilities, such performances may seem insincere. But in the medieval world, where reputation often mattered more than truth, the gesture was everything. A lit fire meant the host had thought of you, had taken time, had spent something of value. Whether that care extended beyond the first hour was another question entirely, one rarely asked aloud. So the next time you imagine a medieval guest room, stone walls warmed by dancing firelight, the bed pulled close to the hearth, pause a moment. Picture the fire roaring as the door opens, servants nodding politely as you enter. Then imagine the silence after you've fallen asleep. The last log splitting in the grate, the glow fading to ash. And in that darkness, the room reveals its true nature. Not cruel, not unkind, simply honest, at last, after the performance has ended. The banquet hall where songs were composed to mock visitors. Imagine a great hall filled with flickering candlelight, the long shadows of carved rafters stretching overhead like silent witnesses. The air is heavy with the mingled scents of roasted meats, beeswax, and the faint metallic trace of old wine. Outside, the sky has turned dark and wet with the chill of approaching rain. Inside, the fire is steady. The music is gentle. The guest of honor lifts a goblet, not yet knowing the song they are about to hear is, in truth, about them. In the noble courts and manor houses of medieval and early Renaissance Europe, entertainment was not merely an afterthought. It was structured, expected, and deeply coded. Among the most popular forms of performance were the traveling troubadours, singers, poets, and musicians who moved from household to household, composing verses tailored to the hosts and their guests. But not all of these songs were praise. Some were something else entirely. In certain households, especially those with a flair for wit and political subtlety, troubadours were quietly instructed to observe the visitors. Not just their clothing or their accent, but their habits, their fumbles, the words they misused, the wine they spilled, the way they hesitated before choosing a seat. These details, small and seemingly forgettable, became verse. Rhymed, melodic, and softly barbed. The songs were not cruel in tone. That was the art of it. Delivered with a smile, set to pleasant lute melodies, they might pass at first as harmless jests. The hall would laugh politely. The guest might even laugh along, at least until the second or third verse revealed a detail so specific, so clearly observed, that it was unmistakably personal. One chronicler in Burgundy describes a visiting merchant from Toulouse who mispronounced a Latin phrase at dinner. The next night, a song titled "The Scholar Who Prayed for Soup" was performed, its chorus repeating the exact slip of the tongue. Everyone laughed. The merchant laughed too. But he left early the next morning. The host recorded the evening's entertainment in a small ledger hidden behind a carved wall panel, still intact in the manor's east wing, centuries later. These ledgers were not uncommon. Often bound in leather and kept in locked chests or tucked behind ornamental moldings, they contained carefully copied verses, some flattering, others not. Many were dated. A few even bore notations, "Guest did not return," or "Bishop took offense." To be mocked in verse was not always a punishment. In some circles, it was considered a kind of attention, proof that one had been noticed, remembered. But it was also a reminder, you were not in control of the narrative. The host was. There is a record from 1471 of a Danish nobleman who, after interrupting his host during a toast, found himself the subject of a ballad titled, "The Man Who Toasted Himself." The lyrics implied vanity, ambition, and poor manners, all in gently lilting rhymes. The nobleman reportedly left without finishing his dessert. Not all guests noticed. Some songs were crafted so subtly that the target missed the reference entirely. But others did. And in such cases, it was nearly impossible to respond. To object to a song was to appear humorless. To demand explanation was to admit one's discomfort. Hosts who employed these techniques knew that silence was their strongest ally. Imagine the troubadour standing just beyond the firelight, plucking a soft rhythm on a gut-strung lute. Their voice is warm, amused, measured. You recognize a phrase, perhaps something you said only hours ago, in jest or nervousness. It returns now in rhyme, gently altered. Around you, the room smiles. A few chuckles. A glance from the host that doesn't quite meet your eyes. The verses were not always spontaneous. Some households kept a book of rhyming structures, templates into which details could be fitted quickly. Others rehearsed more elaborate performances for important guests, especially those with political tension beneath the surface. There's mention of one English baron who hired a troupe to compose satirical songs for visiting rival claimants. Never cruel enough to cause outrage, just memorable enough to assert dominance. And behind it all, the hidden ledgers remained. Bound in dark leather, stored in niches behind carved panels or tucked into false drawers. Pages filled with names, dates, and verses, each a snapshot of a moment, preserved with more care than most treaties. The same walls that bore hunting trophies and woven banners also held quiet archives of humiliation, wit, and social maneuvering. In one manor in the Loire Valley, renovation workers in the 19th century uncovered such a ledger hidden behind a wooden angel carving near the hearth. Inside were dozens of poems, some praising guests for generosity, others noting with rhyming clarity who arrived late, who dressed poorly, who drank too quickly. To live in such a world was to understand the layers beneath every gesture. Politeness and cruelty could wear the same smile. A song could offer warmth and warning in equal measure. And a guest who laughed too loudly might wake the next morning to find their host humming a tune that sounded uncomfortably familiar. And so, if you were ever invited to dine in such a hall, you might find yourself wondering not just what the verses meant, but whom they were meant for. You might laugh. You might listen more carefully than usual. And when the night was over, you might check behind the wall panels before you left, just to see if your name had been quietly written down. Because in this banquet hall, the songs remembered more than the moment. They recorded the guest, the mistake, and the smile that followed.